Of no nation are the beginnings known to history. Its horizon is not entered by the nations of the earth till after they have already gained a peculiar form of their own, and have learned to assert their individuality as against neighboring nations. But before that period has arrived, centuries have passed, of which no man may count the succession. The science of language is no better able than her sister sciences to measure this prehistoric time. But to her alone belong the means of casting a light upon its obscurity. It is in her power to supplement the beginnings of history out of the most ancient documents of the life of nations. For in their languages a connection of kinsmanship may be demonstrated between the most different peoples, otherwise linked to another by no tradition of history. And thus also has the Greek language long been recognized as one of the Indo-Germanic or Aryan sister languages, the mutual agreement of which is complete enough to justify the conclusion that all the nations of this family of languages are only branches of one great nation, which in times immemorial was settled in Upper Asia, and included the ancestors of the Indians, Persians, Greeks, Italicans, Germans, Slavs, and Celts. This Aryan primitive people did not at once separate into its different parts. But the latter grew out of the mother trunk like branches. Gradually the members fell off, and in very different currents ensued the movements of population westwards from the common home to form settlements in particular localities. It has been assumed on good grounds that the Celts who pushed forward farthest to the west were the first to separate from the main body and to immigrate into Europe. The Celts were followed by the Germans, and last of all by the Slavs, united with the Lets, Lithuanians. These together form a North European body of nations and languages. Distinct from these, there existed a second succession of nations which separated from the primitive trunk at a later date, and whose mission it was to occupy the islands on the coast and the peninsulas of the Mediterranean. Whereas the Medo-Persian and untouched by Western influences, the Indian family of nations remained behind deep in the heart of Asia. The two main members of the above-mentioned The two main members of the above-mentioned second succession of nations, which settled on the coasts of the same sea, opposite to one another, in localities of a similar character, and by the history of classic antiquity, were anew united into an inseparable pair of nations. The Greeks and the Italicans appear to us so closely intertwined from the very first by the genius character of their languages that we are obliged to assume the existence of a period in which both, separated from all other nations, formed one nation by themselves. As such, they not only, in addition to the most ancient common property of all Sanskrit nations, collected and developed a new common treasure of words and terms, as is e.g. evidenced in the names common to both for the fruits and implements of the field, for wine and oil, and in their agreement in the designation of the godless presiding over the fire of the hearth. And in their agreement in the designation of the goddess presiding over the fire of the hearth. But, which is still more important, they are at one in their phonetic laws. But, which is still more important, they are at one in their phonetic laws, especially in the multiplicity and delicacy of the shades, peculiar to Latin and Greek, in their vocalization. The A sound prevailing in Sanskrit divided itself into three sounds, a, e, o, and by this subdivision of the vowel, there accrued not only a gain in euphony, but the possibility of a more delicate organization in the formation of language. For it constitutes the basis of the formation of the declensions, of the clear distinction between the masculine and feminine gender on the one, and the neuter on the other side, a main advantage which these languages possess above all others. Finally, before the Greeks and Italians separated into two nations, they perfected a law which affords a remarkable proof of the fact that these races were preeminently distinguished by a sense of order and regularity. They would not even leave to arbitrary decision what is most evanescent in language, the accentuation of words, but introduced a fixed rule that no main accent should fall farther back than the antepenultimate. By this means the unity of words is protected. The final syllables are secured, which easily lose by the accent falling farther back, and lastly, notwithstanding all the severity of the rule, sufficient liberty is permitted to make recognizable by slight changes of accentuation the differences of genders and cases in nouns, and of tenses and moods in verbs. These instances of harmony in language are the most ancient documents of a common national history of the Greeks and Italicans, the testimonies of a period in which, on one of the resting places of the great migration in Asia from east to west, the two nations dwelt together and conquered as one people of Greco-Italicans, as we may call them, and if we may dare to indicate In accordance with what is common to both branches in language and history, the character of the primitive people, we shall find its features to consist above all in a sense of reasonable order, founded on a peasant life, in a dislike of everything arbitrary and chaotic, in a manly effort to attain to a clear development and to a rational system of laws, life, and thought. Apart from these important and vital instances of harmony, we see a very great difference prevailing between the two languages. To take vocalization first, the Greek language has an abundance of consonant sounds. It especially preserves the complete series of mute consonants, of which the Italicans have entirely lost the aspirates. On the other hand, the Greek lost at an early period two aspirant sounds, the J and the V, faithfully preserved in Latin, the so-called digamma, which was indeed retained in certain spoken dialects, but which otherwise either utterly lost or changed into the aspirate sound, spiritus asper, or dissolved into a diphthong. Neither were the Greeks able to preserve the sibilant sound to the acuteness in which it remains in the Indian and Italic languages. And Italic languages, cf. sama, simul, spav. This loss and weakening of important sounds is very susceptible in Greek. The roots of words have in many instances lost their distinguishing characteristics, and the most various roots have, in consequence of the destruction of their initial sounds and laute, become confused together, till it is almost impossible to recognize them individually. But in spite of these evils, we continue to remark the thoroughgoing process of the language, its consistency and regularity, the certainty of its orthography, a testimony of the great delicacy of the vocal organs, which distinguish the Hellenes from the barbarians, and of a clearly marked pronunciation such as the Italic races seem not to have possessed in an equal degree. In Greek, the sound of the endings of words is equally subject to a fixed rule, for whilst in Sanskrit all words in the sounds of their endings completely adapt themselves to the initial sounds of the next, and in Latin all words stand independently one by the side of the other. The Greeks have in this matter fixed the delicately conceived law according to which all their words must end in vowels or such consonants as give rise to no harshness. No! No harshness when followed by others, vis and r and s. By this means, words preserve a greater independence than in Sanskrit, and speech more unity and fluency than in Latin, while the endings are secured against constant change. Secured against constant change. Secured against constant change. Secure against constant change. As well as against being cut short. And mutilated. In variety of forms, the Greek language cannot for a moment compare itself to the Indian any more than the vegetation of the Eurotas to that of the banks of the Ganges. Thus, in declension, the Greeks have lost 3 out of 8 cases, and the rest have accordingly had to be overloaded with a multiplicity of meanings, an evil which the language could only meet by a delicate development of the preposition. The Italicans, in their love for terseness and brevity of expression, retained the ablative and partially also the locative. On the other hand, according to the practical tendency of their habits of thought, they gave up the dual, which the Greeks could not spare. In declension, also, the Greeks find a great advantage in the multiplicity of their diphthongs, while preserving as much similarity as possible in the forms. The differences of gender are easily and clearly marked, and even in the case endings as an e.g. For pedes, the Greeks, notwithstanding their poverty, possess the advantage of a clearer distinction. But their strength lies in the verb. The entire conservative force of the Greek language has applied itself to verbal forms. And here it surpasses the Italic in all main points. It has preserved for itself a double series of personal affixes, which in a light and agreeable manner divide the tenses into principal and historic tenses, and augment and reduplication are retained for the language and carried out with admirable delicacy, so as to be easily perceptible through the most varying initial sounds of the verbs, with the aid of the various verbal forms, that of the root and that of the accretion in the present tense. The language succeeds in expressing with the utmost facility the greatest multiplicity of the notions of time, its point and duration, and the completion of an action in itself. Let us only consider how, by a mere lengthening of the vowel in and, a double meaning, each so clearly and surely distinguished from the other, is obtained, a mobility which the Latin language, with its lincebum and liqui, only makes a clumsy and unsatisfactory endeavor to follow. By means of the double formation of the aorist, this distinction becomes possible with every verbal root, and can everywhere be carried out by the simplest means of vocalization through active, middle, and passive voices. Again, let us remember the forms of the moods, by which the verb is able to follow the ideas of man through the most delicate distinctions of the conditioned and the unconditioned, the possible and the actual. The material for these formations doubtless already existed in a much earlier state of the language, but the older nations were incapable of using it. For the Greeks, the lengthening of the connecting vowel, together with the endings of the principal tenses, sufficed for creating in the subjunctive a fixed type for a conditioned statement, and in the insertion of an I sound, together with the endings of the secondary tenses, we have the creation of the operative, which, like the subjunctive, on account of its easy formation, could be carried out through the tenses. And yet these simple means of vocalization are not purely differences of form or arbitrary. The lengthening of the sound between the root and the personal ending so naturally and meaningly distinguishes the hesitating and conditioned statement from the unconditioned, and the particular vowel which in the characteristic of the optative, since as a root it signifies to go, marks the motion of the soul in desire transcending the limits of the present. A wish is by its very nature opposed to the present and the possible to the actual. Accordingly, the optative takes the endings of the secondary tenses which signify the non-present, while the conditioned mood, on account of its relation to the present of the speaker, has the endings of the main tenses. Lastly, in the formation of words, the Greek language shows a great mobility. As compared with the italic, by the help of light suffixes, it most deftly contrives to characterize clearly the derivations from substantives and from adjectives according to their different significations. It forms new words out of old. By combinations of the latter with a facility entirely wanting to the Latin, but it abstains from abusing this facility or amusing itself, like the later Sanskrit, with cumulative words in which the most various elements, incapable of ever being amalgamated into one picture or idea, are as it were massed together into a bundle of roots, here as everywhere. Moderation and transparency are the characteristics of the Greek language.